The porcelain shattered on the porch, a white explosion against the gray wood. But the sound wasn't what stopped me. It was her face. For 6 months, Iris had been a study in perfect angles, spine straight, smile polite, guard up. I knew angles. I built a career on them. But standing there, clutching a stack of envelopes, I saw the geometry fail. Her mask slipped, just for a second, revealing a chaos so raw it pulled the air right out of my lungs. That was the moment the game changed. I didn't retire because I lost. I retired because I stopped feeling the tip of the blade. 12 years on the fencing strip, living inside a mask, reading the micro-expressions of opponents through a steel mesh. I took bronze in London because I hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught in the beauty of the parry instead of the kill. That hesitation cost me gold, but it taught me something valuable. Perfection is just a breath held too long. When I came home, silence was the only thing I craved. People assume carrying mail is a surrender. They see the uniform, the walking shorts, the heavy bag, and they think I gave up. They don't understand the discipline of the route. It's physical chess. Every morning, the mail is a new opponent, sorted and stacked. The weight on my shoulder is a grounding wire. 35 pounds of bills, birthday cards, and jury summonses. It keeps you honest. My world narrowed down to streets and numbers. I liked it that way. The rhythm of the walk became my new training. Left foot, right foot, scan the yard, deliver, move. No cameras, no coaches screaming about form, just the slap of leather on pavement and the quiet hum of a neighborhood waking up. I learned the geometry of this town better than I knew the lines of my own hand. I knew which dogs would bark before I hit the walkway. I knew which sprinklers fired off at 10:03 a.m. exactly. I mapped the shadows, moving through them to keep the sweat off my neck in July. It was a study in efficiency. I didn't stop for small talk. I didn't pet the golden retrievers. I was a ghost in blue, passing through lives without touching them. That was the rule. Maintain the distance. Keep the heart rate steady. The discipline saved me. It gave me a place to put the restless energy that used to keep me awake until 3 a.m. practicing lunges in my living room. Here, the targets were stationary. The mailboxes didn't fight back. I found peace in the repetition, in the absolute certainty that if I walked this path, the bag would get lighter. By the end of the loop, I was empty. Clean. But every route has a variable, an anomaly in the data set. For me, it was 42 Elm Street. It wasn't the biggest house on the block. It was a craftsman bungalow, painted a sensible slate blue, with a porch that wrapped around the front like a protective arm. The lawn was manicured to a level that bordered on obsessive. Not a dandelion dared to show its face. The hedges were trimmed into sharp, severe lines. It was beautiful, but it was tight. Tension coiled in the landscaping. I started noticing the details in the second month. The way the curtains were always drawn to the exact same width, the specific brand of organic coffee grounds in the recycling bin on Tuesdays, the silence that seemed to sit heavier on that property than anywhere else. And then there was the owner. She wasn't usually outside. Most people on my route were invisible, just names on magazines. But she was there, often just leaving or just arriving, moving with a kind of deliberate grace that caught my eye. She didn't walk, she glided. She carried herself like she was balancing a book on her head, or maybe the weight of the world. I'd watch her from 3 houses away. Not staring, observing. Old habits die hard. I assessed her the way I used to size up an opponent before the mask came down. Posture, rigid. Stride, consistent. Defense, impenetrable. She was a fortress. And for a long time, I was content to just walk the perimeter, respecting the walls she'd built. I didn't know then that the walls weren't there to keep people out. They were there to keep the storm inside from spilling over. I didn't know that the precision I admired was actually a cage. I just knew that when I reached Elm Street, my heart rate didn't stay steady. The rhythm broke. The cool, detached athlete in me stumbled, just a little, every time I saw her car in the drive. The pull was undeniable, a disruption I couldn't calculate. Her name was Iris. It suited her, something rooted, yet delicate enough to bruise if you handled it with clumsy hands. She taught history at the private academy on the north side, a place where tuition cost more than my annual salary. I knew this not because we spoke, but because the mail tells you everything if you know how to read it. Her delivery slot was a constant diet of thick academic journals and heavy hardcover biographies. The Origins of European Conflict, The Architecture of Silence. Serious books for a serious woman. I spent 6 months studying her, with the same obsessive precision I once applied to reading an opponent's torso for a tell. With Iris, I looked for the cracks in the perfection. I found none. She left at 7:15 a.m., sharp. She returned at 4:20 p.m., her silver Volvo gliding into the driveway with a quiet purr. She moved with an economy of motion that made everyone else look frantic. She didn't walk. She transitioned from point A to point B. Our interactions were a masterclass in professional distance. I'd be coming up the walk, the heat of the afternoon radiating off the pavement, and she would be there, collecting the mail. "Good afternoon," she would say. Her voice was low, textured like expensive fabric, careful and modulated. "Afternoon, Iris," I'd reply, keeping my tone breezy, neutral. "Thank you. Stay safe in the heat." Always. That was a script. Safe, predictable, a perfect shield of politeness constructed brick by brick. But beneath the surface, I was losing the match. The athlete in me knew I was compromised. I wasn't just delivering mail. I was waiting for her. I'd catch myself adjusting my pace 3 streets over, walking faster through the cul-de-sacs just to hit Elm Street during that 10-minute window when she arrived home. It was pathetic. It was tactical. The contrast between us was almost comical. I was the physical reality, sweat-stained polo, calves burning from 6 miles of walking, hair pulled back in a utilitarian knot. I smelled of ozone, sunscreen, and leather. Iris was the intellectual ideal. She wore silk blouses that shimmered in the sun, tailored trousers, and heels that clicked with authority. She smelled of sandalwood and old paper. Standing next to her on the porch felt like standing next to a museum exhibit. I was afraid if I moved too fast, I'd shatter the glass. But I saw things. I noticed the way she held her keys, tight, knuckles white, as if she expected someone to try and take them. I noticed the ink stains on her middle finger, a small, chaotic smudge on an otherwise pristine hand. That smudge fascinated me. It was the only evidence that she struggled, that she pressed down hard to make her mark. I found myself staring at it one Tuesday when she signed for a registered letter. She leaned in, the pen hovering. The distance between us collapsed. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She looked up, catching my stare. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and for a split second, guarded. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "No," I lied, my heart hammering a traitorous rhythm against my ribs. "Just admiring the penmanship." She didn't smile. She just held my gaze, unflinching. "Precision matters." "It does," I agreed. She finished signing and retreated inside, the heavy door clicking shut like a vault. I stood there, staring at the wood, the adrenaline spiking in my blood. I knew then that the distance wasn't just politeness. It was a dam. And I was the idiot standing at the base of it, waiting for the water to break. I told myself to stop looking, to just do the job. But the pull was magnetic. I was an object in motion, and she was the gravity I couldn't escape. The sky bruised purple around 2 o'clock. By 2:15, the bottom dropped out. This wasn't a polite drizzle. It was a freezing sheet of water turning gutters into rivers. My boots slipped on the slick pavement. The mailbag became a dead weight, the leather soaking through despite the cover. I marched through the deluge, head down, focused only on finishing the loop. Then I hit Elm Street. The manicured lawn was drowning. The severe hedges were whipped into a frenzy. And there was the silver Volvo, parked crookedly in the drive. A first. Iris was out there. Not gliding, not transitioning. She was fighting. She had the trunk open, arms full of paper grocery bags losing their structural integrity. She was trying to close the trunk with her hip while balancing the load, but the wind caught her hair, whipping it across her face. She looked small. She looked overwhelmed. Then the bottom of the left bag gave out. Oranges hit the driveway, rolling into the gutter like bright, escaping planets. I didn't think. Protocol says secure the mail. Protocol says keep moving. I dropped the mailbag on the dry patch of her porch and sprinted back down the walk. "Leave them!" I shouted over the wind. She jumped, spinning around. Her eyes were wide, panicked. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, if the deer was wearing soaked silk. Another bag started to tear. "I can't," she started, her voice thin against the storm. I was there in 3 strides. I unzipped my heavy, waterproof postal parka, the one thing keeping me dry, and swung it off. It was fluid, muscle memory from 1,000 warm-ups. I didn't hand it to her. I stepped in close, invading the perimeter, and draped it over her shoulders and the crumbling bags. The world narrowed to the space under that jacket. The rain hammered my uniform shirt, soaking me to the skin, shocking and cold. But the heat radiating off her was startling. We were inches apart. I could smell the ozone of the storm, the wet asphalt, and beneath it all, that distinct sandalwood scent, now mixed with the sharp tang of adrenaline. "Go," I ordered, my voice cutting through the noise. "To the porch. Now." She didn't argue. She turned and ran, the oversized blue jacket swallowing her frame. I scooped up the remaining survivors, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and followed. We collapsed onto the porch, under the shelter of the overhang. The silence of the reprieve was deafening. The rain pounded on the roof, a violent drum roll. But here, in the dry air, it felt like we were in a bubble. Iris stood there, my jacket dripping onto her porch planks. She was shivering, not just from cold, but from shock. Her hair was ruined, plastered to her cheeks. Mascara, usually applied with surgical precision, smudged under her left eye. She looked wrecked. She looked real. She looked down at the oranges scattered on the driveway, then back at me. I was standing there in my soaked polo, water dripping off my nose, shivering slightly. "My groceries," she whispered, as if that was the tragedy. "Forget the oranges, Iris," I said, wiping water from my eyes. I looked at her, really looked at her. The facade had been breached by weather. Her defenses were down because she was too cold to hold them up. Her eyes held a storm of their own. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself. It smelled like me, like rain and work and leather. She seemed to realize it at the same moment I did. Her cheeks flushed, a splash of color that had nothing to do with the cold. She faltered, the articulate history teacher lost for words. "I'm a mess." I stepped closer. The magnetic pull was back, stronger now that barriers were crumbling. I let my gaze linger on that smudge of mascara, on the wet strands of hair clinging to her neck. "Yeah," I said, my voice dropping, losing its professional edge. I let a small, crooked grin slip through. "You are. It's a good look on you." The air between us charged, heavy and thick. It wasn't the polite distance anymore. It was intimate, charged. The comment hung there, a tease, a challenge, a compliment wrapped in observation. Her eyes widened slightly. She didn't step back. She didn't correct me. She just stood there, wrapped in my warmth, breathing hard. The rain kept falling, but neither of us was looking at the sky anymore. The geometry had shifted. The lines were blurred. And for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't just the carrier, and she wasn't just the customer. We were just 2 women, breathing the same damp air, waiting for the other to blink. "You're turning blue," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an assessment. She didn't wait for my permission. She turned the key in the lock, the mechanism sliding home with a heavy, expensive thunk, and pushed the door open. She looked back at me, shivering under the overhang, water pooling around my boots. The invitation was implicit in the angle of her body, the way she held the door just wide enough for me to slip through. I crossed the threshold. Entering her house felt like stepping inside a lung that had just taken a deep breath. The air was still, warm, and scented with something dry and ancient. Cedar, perhaps, or the vanilla decay of very old paper. The chaos of the storm vanished the moment the door clicked shut behind us. The silence here was architectural. It had weight. It pressed against my eardrums, demanding reverence. I stood on the foyer mat, acutely aware of the water dripping from my shorts, the squelch of my socks, the smell of wet wool and ozone clinging to me. I was a contaminant, a blue-clad stain on her pristine, beige reality. "Stay there," she commanded, her voice regaining some of its classroom authority. I'll get towels. She disappeared down a hallway lined with framed maps. I took the moment to breathe. The house was exactly as I had calculated from the curb. Precise, curated, and terrifyingly lonely. The living room to my left was a study in minimalism. Cream sofas, glass tables, a fireplace that looked like it had never seen a log. There were no throw blankets, no magazines left open on the armrest, no stray shoes kicked into a corner. It was a showroom for a life, not a life itself. She returned with thick white towels. She handed me one without making eye contact, her focus shifting to the puddles forming around my boots. "The kitchen has tile," she said. "Come on." I followed her. The kitchen was an operating theater of culinary intent. White marble counters, stainless steel appliances that gleamed under recessed lighting, a center island that could land a small plane. She moved to the coffee maker, a complex machine of glass and chrome, and began the ritual. I watched her hands. They were shaking. Just a tremor, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. She measured the grounds with unnecessary force, the scoop hitting the canister with a sharp clack. She was rattled. Not just by the rain, but by the intrusion. By me. "You have a beautiful home, Iris," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the acoustic perfection of the room. She didn't turn. "It's efficient." "It's quiet," I corrected. "Like a library after hours." She paused, the kettle in her hand. "I prefer the quiet. It helps me think." "What are you thinking about right now?" She turned then, the steaming mugs in her hands. She set one down on the marble in front of me. "That I have a mail carrier dripping rainwater in my kitchen, and I don't even know her name." "Riley," I said. I reached for the mug. Our fingers didn't touch, but the heat from her hand lingered on the ceramic. "My name is Riley." "Riley." She tested the word, tasting the vowels. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning me over the rim. The mascara was still smudged, a dark bruise against her pale skin. It was the only flaw in the room, and I couldn't stop looking at it. "You're staring," she said, lowering the cup. "I'm observing," I countered, leaning my hip against the cold counter. The coffee was dark, bitter, and hot enough to burn. It grounded me. "Occupational hazard. You learn to read the root." "And what does my root tell you?" Her voice had an edge now, a defensive parry. She was rebuilding her composure, brick by brick, right in front of me. I took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch. I knew how to play this game. Wait for the opponent to overextend. "It tells me you value control," I said softly. "It tells me you curate everything. Your lawn, your books, your schedule. You build a fortress so no one sees what's actually happening inside." Her grip on the mug tightened. Her knuckles went white. "You think you know me because you deliver my bills?" "I think I know what it looks like when someone is holding their breath," I said. The air between us thickened, charged with the proximity and the sudden sharp turn of the conversation. I wasn't just the carrier anymore. I was the intruder who had seen the cracks. She looked away, toward the dining room. "You don't know anything, Riley." But she didn't tell me to leave. I followed her gaze. The dining room table was visible through the archway. Unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't empty. It was covered in stacks of paper. Not graded essays, not history books. These were legal-sized envelopes, windowed and ominous. And amidst the white paper, I saw something else, a flash of chaotic color. A child's drawing? A photograph? It was buried, half hidden under a foreclosure notice that had slipped from a pile. The perfection was a lie. The silence wasn't peace. It was the holding of breath before a scream. "Maybe not," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was almost a whisper. "But I know you're drowning out there, Iris. And it's not just the rain." She looked back at me, and for the first time, the defiance was gone. In its place was an exhaustion so profound it made my chest ache. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, but the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring, a harsh electronic pulse that shattered the intimacy of the kitchen. Iris jumped, her hand flying to her throat. The fear in her eyes wasn't social anxiety. It was terror. "Ignore it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Iris?" "Please," she said, and the desperation in that single word stripped away the last of the teacher, the homeowner, the facade. Just Don't let them know I'm here. The ringing stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that felt bruised. I moved to the window, keeping my body angled against the wall, out of sight. Through the sheer curtains, I saw a man in a cheap suit walking back to a sedan that had seen better days. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't a friend. He carried a clipboard like a weapon, and he tucked a pink slip of paper into the door jamb before driving away. Process server. I knew the walk. I knew the slump of the shoulders that said, nothing personal, just business. I turned back to the room. Iris hadn't moved. She was gripping the marble island so hard her fingernails were colorless. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the floor, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He's gone, I said, my voice low. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The composure I have admired for 6 months, the perfect posture, the modulated voice, the precise schedule, had evaporated. In its place was a woman vibrating with a shame so potent it filled the room like smoke. I stepped away from the window. The kitchen felt too small now, the air too thin. I walked toward the dining room archway. I hadn't meant to pry earlier, but now the context had shifted. The house wasn't a sanctuary. It was a siege. I walked up to the mahogany table. Up close, the chaos was legible. It wasn't just mail. It was an autopsy of a life. There were stacks of envelopes I recognized. I had delivered them. But opened, they told a different story. Final notice, stamped in red ink that looked like blood against the crisp white paper. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Notice of default. Foreclosure proceedings. The secret wasn't a scandal. It was a collapse. The beautiful house, the manicured lawn, the organic coffee. It was all stage set for a play that had run out of funding. The dates on the letters went back months. While I was admiring her grace on the porch, she was drowning in arrears inside. While I was envying her silence, she was sitting at this table, calculating how many days she had left before the locks were changed. I saw a letter from the private school where she taught. It wasn't a contract renewal. It was a discussion about staff reduction. She was losing everything. The fortress wasn't keeping the world out. It was the only thing holding her up. And the foundation was rotting. Don't. The word was a fracture. I turned. Iris was standing in the archway, her arms wrapped around herself, the oversized postal jacket slipping off one shoulder. She looked stripped. The intellectual superiority, the class difference, the cool distance, it was all gone. I didn't want you to see, she whispered. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was too exhausted for tears. I didn't want anyone to see. It's just paper, Iris, I said, though we both knew it was more than that. It was dignity. It was the terrifying reality of the ground opening up beneath you. It's not just paper, she snapped, a flash of anger cutting through the shame. She walked to the table, her hand hovering over the wreckage. It's failure. Precise, documented failure. He left 8 months ago. He liquidated the accounts before he filed. I've been paying the mortgage on credit cards. I've been pretending to go to work for 3 weeks because I can't bear to tell the neighbors I was let go. She picked up a foreclosure notice and crumpled it, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet room. You look at me like I'm stable, like I'm safe. But I'm just a squatter in my own life. She looked at me then, really looked at me, waiting for the pity. She expected me to back away. People don't like the smell of desperation. It's contagious. They want the fantasy of the woman on the porch, not the reality of the woman with the negative bank balance. But I didn't back away. I knew about loss. I knew what it felt like to stand on a podium and feel like the biggest failure in the world because you missed the mark by a fraction of a second. I looked at the mess on the table, the debris of her carefully constructed world, and I didn't blink. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell her it would be okay, because I didn't know if it would be. You're not a squatter, I said, my voice steady, grounding. You're a fighter who's taking heavy hits. There's a difference. I reached out and took the crumpled paper from her hand. I smoothed it down on the table, pressing my palm flat against the creases. The geometry of the room had changed again. The walls were down. The secret was out. And the space between us wasn't filled with polite lies anymore. It was filled with the heavy, jagged truth. I see you, Iris, I said, holding her gaze. I see the mess. and I'm not leaving. The sun returned 3 days later, mocking the gray intensity of that afternoon in the kitchen. It was one of those aggressively bright Tuesdays, where the shadows are sharp and the pavement shimmers. The neighborhood had reset. Lawns were dry, sprinklers ticked in their rhythmic arcs, and the world pretended the storm never happened. But I carried the memory of it like a physical weight in my bag. Every step toward Elm Street felt heavier, charged with a new kind of electricity. The code of the route was broken. I wasn't just delivering letters anymore. I was returning to the scene of the crash. I saw her car in the driveway, the silver Volvo, polished again, gleaming as if it hadn't been filled with rain-soaked groceries just 72 hours ago. The house looked impenetrable once more. The curtains were drawn to their precise widths. The silence was back in place, a heavy blanket over the property. If I hadn't seen the papers on the dining room table, I would have believed the lie. I would have believed that Iris was just the elegant woman who lived in the elegant house. But I knew. And knowing changed the gravity. I walked up the path, my boots crunching on the dry concrete. The sound seemed louder than usual. My heart rate, usually a flat line of athletic discipline, spiked. I checked my pulse against my wrist. Thump, thump, thump. Fast. Too fast. She opened the door before I could knock. She was wearing sunglasses, big dark frames that hid her eyes, and a crisp linen dress that looked like it cost more than my rent. The armor was back on. Her defenses were rebuilt, freshly painted, and reinforced. "Afternoon, Riley," she said. Her voice was steady, the professional modulation back in place. But she didn't step back. She stood right at the threshold, occupying the space where the door usually acted as a shield. "Iris," I nodded, keeping my tone easy, though my chest felt tight. "Bright out here today." "Blinding," she agreed. She reached out for the mail I was holding, a stack of catalogs and a single, thin envelope. No scary windowed letters today. Just junk and possibility. This was the moment, the handover, the standard exchange of goods that happens a million times a day. But this wasn't standard. I extended the stack. She reached for it. Our fingers met. Usually you avoid contact. It's part of the job. You hold the edge, they take the middle. Efficient. Sterile. But today, my grip didn't loosen immediately, and her hand didn't retreat. Her fingers were cool against the heat of my skin. They brushed against my knuckles, a soft, deliberate friction that sent a shockwave straight up my arm. It wasn't an accident. In fencing, you know the difference between a graze and a target hit. This was a hit. I looked at her, really looked at her, past the sunglasses. I saw the tension in her jaw, the slight parting of her lips. She was terrified, but she wasn't pulling away. I held the mail for a second too long, forcing her to stay connected to me. The air between us thickened, heavy with the scent of her sandalwood and the heat radiating off the pavement. "You got the armor back on tight," I said softly, my voice a low rumble. I tilted my head, studying her. But I liked the mess, Iris. It felt honest. It was a calculated lunge. I was acknowledging the secret, teasing the perfection, and flirting, all in one breath. She went still. The air in her lungs seemed to catch. Then, slowly, she took off the sunglasses. Her eyes were clear, dark, and startlingly vulnerable. There was no anger there, just a raw, exposed hunger that mirrored my own. "The mess is still there," she whispered, her voice losing its polished edge. "I just tidied up the edges." "Don't tidy up on my account," I said, letting a smile play at the corner of my mouth. I rubbed my thumb almost imperceptibly against the side of her hand, a tiny, intimate caress before I let go of the mail. "I think you look dangerous when you're unraveling, like a storm I want to get caught in." Her breath hitched. She looked down at her hand, at the place where my thumb had been, then back up at me. A flush crept up her neck, pink and undeniable against the pale linen. She didn't retreat. She leaned in, just an inch. It was a microscopic movement, but to an athlete, it was a scream. She was leaning into the gravity. "Be careful what you wish for, Riley," she murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Storms leave damage." "I'm retired," I said, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. "I don't mind a little damage. Keeps things interesting." We stood there for a beat longer than sanity allowed. The neighborhood hummed around us, but the silence on the porch was its own world, a world where the mail carrier and the history teacher were standing on the precipice. Then she stepped back. The moment broke, but the tether remained. "See you tomorrow," she said, her voice soft, promising. "Count on it," I replied. I turned and walked back down the path, my legs feeling lighter, the bag feeling empty. I didn't look back, but I could feel her watching me. I could feel the heat of her gaze on the back of my neck, hotter than the sun. The game wasn't over. We had just entered the next round. I expected the momentum to carry. In physics, an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. We had motion. We had heat. The air on that porch had been volatile enough to ignite. But I forgot that fear is the strongest force of all. Wednesday was a vacuum. I walked up the path at 10:14 a.m., my body humming with a kinetic anticipation I hadn't felt since the semifinals in London. I was ready for the next beat, the next volley. I wanted to see if the flush was still on her neck. I wanted to see if the armor was still unlatched. But the house was sealed. The blinds were drawn tight, shutting out the sun and the street. The silver Volvo was in the drive, but the property felt abandoned. I slotted the mail, a utility bill, and a flyer for a pizza place, and waited. Usually, I'd hear footsteps. I'd hear the heavy thunk of the deadbolt. Today, there was only the sound of the metal flap snapping shut on its spring. She was there. I knew it. I could feel the displacement of the air on the other side of the door. She was standing right there, holding her breath, waiting for me to leave. She was retreating. Thursday was worse. She was outside when I turned the corner, deadheading the roses with a violence that suggested the flowers had personally offended her. As soon as she saw me, she stiffened. The fluid grace vanished. She didn't run, but she shut down. "Morning, Iris," I said, slowing my pace, offering an opening. "Riley," she clipped. She didn't look at me. She looked at the shears in her hand. "Just put it in the box, please. I'm in a hurry." The dismissal was absolute. It was a parry so hard it jarred my teeth. She turned her back before I could even reach the porch, marching toward the side gate as if she had a meeting with the president. I stood there, the mail in my hand, feeling the rejection settle in my gut like cold lead. The connection we'd built, the shared coffee, the rain, the thumb on her hand, she was erasing it. She was rewriting the history of the last week to fit the safety of the last 6 months. I know this tactic. It's the flinch before the engage. The realization that you've overextended and left your chest open, so you scramble back to the safety of the starting line. They turtle. They hide. Iris wasn't rejecting me because she didn't feel the pull. She was rejecting me because she did. She had let a stranger see the wreckage of her life, the foreclosure, the divorce, the shame. And in the harsh light of a sunny Thursday, the vulnerability was terrifying. She was trying to put the genie back in the bottle. She wanted to be the composed history teacher again, not the woman drowning in debt who leaned into a mail carrier's touch. But you can't unring a bell, and you can't unsee a soul. I finished the route on autopilot. The rhythm was off. The geometry of the neighborhood felt jagged, wrong. Every step away from Elm Street felt like a mistake. I was angry. Not at her, but at the lie. We were pretending to be strangers again, and the pretense tasted like ash. I spent Friday analyzing the retreat. I deconstructed it. She was scared that if she let me in again, I'd see more of the mess. She thought the attraction was fragile, that it couldn't survive the reality of her chaos. She thought she had to be perfect to be wanted. I didn't want perfect. I wanted the woman who ate oranges off the driveway in the rain. By Saturday afternoon, the frustration had peaked. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't walk up that path, wear the uniform, deliver the final notice letters, and pretend I didn't want to burn them for her. The uniform was the problem. It was a barrier. As long as I was the carrier, she was the customer, and the power dynamic was all wrong. It gave her a wall to hide behind. I needed to change the terms of the engagement. I finished my shift at 3. I drove back to my apartment, the silence of the empty weekend stretching out before me. I stood in front of the mirror and stripped off the blue shirt. I took off the badge. I unlaced the heavy work boots. I showered, scrubbing the ozone and the root off my skin. I dressed slowly, deliberately. Dark jeans, a black t-shirt that fit close to the skin, my leather jacket. I wasn't dressing for work. I was dressing for a confrontation. I got into my own car, not the truck. The drive to Elm Street felt different without the stops. It was a straight line, a direct attack. I parked 3 houses down. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. I walked up the street, my footsteps silent in sneakers. I wasn't the ghost in blue anymore. I was just Riley. And I wasn't here to deliver mail. I walked up the path to number 42. The house loomed, silent and fortress-like. The curtains were still drawn. I didn't hesitate. I didn't check for dogs. I walked straight to the door and raised my hand. I didn't knock politely. I knocked 3 times, hard. The sound echoed like a challenge. I waited. I could feel the tension radiating from the wood. I knew she was in there. And this time, I wasn't going to let her hide. The door opened 2 inches. The safety chain was drawn. A literal silver line drawn across the gap between us. Iris peered through the crack, her face pale and stripped of makeup, her hair pulled back in a severe, punishing knot that pulled the skin tight at her temples. She looked at me, squinting against the low sun, and for a second, she didn't recognize the woman standing there. She was looking for the blue uniform, the badge, the heavy bag. She was looking for the function, not the person. When realization hit, her eyes widened. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, knuckles bleaching white. Riley? Her voice was a whisper, rough with disuse, as if she hadn't spoken to a soul since Thursday. "Open the door, Iris." "It's Saturday," she said, the words fumbling out. You're not working." "Exactly," I said, leaning in, letting her see the resolve in my jaw. "Which means I'm not bound by the Hatch Act. I'm not on a schedule. And I'm not leaving until you talk to me. Open the door." She hesitated. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the rapid risk assessment of a woman who felt her control slipping. She wanted to slam it shut. I saw the muscle in her forearm flex, preparing to retreat. "I can't," she said, her voice dropping. I'm not a guest, Iris, and I'm not the bank. I'm the one who knows about the oranges in the gutter. You don't have to stage the set for me." That hit the mark. The reference to her vulnerability froze her. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her posture in a slow exhale. The chain rattled, a harsh metallic sound in the quiet evening, as she slid it back. The door swung open. I stepped inside. The house felt different than it had during the storm. Then it had been a refuge, a warm, cedar-scented lung. Now it felt like a bunker. The curtains were drawn against the light, leaving the hallway in a murky, suffocating twilight. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of cold coffee and anxiety. It was the atmosphere of someone waiting for a blow to land. "What are you doing here?" She stood with her arms crossed, a defensive barrier over her chest. She was wearing oversized gray sweatpants and a t-shirt that had seen better days, the uniform of depression. It was a jarring contrast to the tailored silk and linen I had studied for 6 months. This was the raw data. "I'm here because you ghosted me," I said, keeping my voice low but firm, the sound absorbing into the dense silence of the hall. "Tuesday, we were standing on a precipice. Wednesday, you pretended I didn't exist. I don't like being erased, Iris." "I didn't erase you," she deflected, looking at the floorboards. "I just regained my senses." "Is that what you call it? Because from where I stood, it looked like a retreat. It looked like cowardice." Her head snapped up. Fire returned to her eyes. Good. Anger was a fuel I could work with. Apathy was a dead end. "You don't know me well enough to call me a coward." "I know enough," I countered, stepping closer, invading her personal space with deliberate precision. "I know you're losing this house. I know your husband left you with a mountain of debt and a bruised ego. I know you're terrified that if anyone looks too closely at the history teacher, they'll see that she's history herself." She flinched. It was a brutal riposte, sharp and unflinching, but it was necessary. I had to break the shell to get to the woman hiding inside. "Get out," she hissed, tears springing to her eyes, not from sadness, but from fury. "Make me." I took another step. The air between us charged instantly, thickening with a static tension that made the hair on my arm stand up. I wasn't the mail carrier anymore. I was the opponent who refused to disengage. You're pushing me away because it's easier to be alone than to be seen, I continued, my voice softening, shifting from accusation to observation. You think if I see the mess, the real mess, not just the groceries, I'll run. You think you have to be the woman on the porch to be wanted. I am the woman on the porch, she cried, her voice cracking. That's who I'm supposed to be. I'm not this. She gestured wildly at herself, at the dark house, at the invisible wreckage of her life. I have nothing to offer you, Riley. I'm bankrupt, in every sense of the word. I'm a sinking ship, and you're standing on the deck asking for a tour. I'm not looking for a tour. And I'm not looking for a payout. I closed the final distance. We were inches apart now. I could smell the sandalwood soap she used, faint now, buried under the scent of stress, but still there. I could see the pulse jumping frantically in the hollow of her throat. Admit it, I challenged, my voice a low rumble. Tell me you didn't feel the ground shift when I touched your hand. Tell me I'm imagining the heat in this room right now. She looked at me, her breath hitching, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. She was trembling, vibrating with the effort to hold herself together, but the foundation was gone. It doesn't matter what I feel, she whispered, the fight bleeding out of her. It's too complicated. It's too messy. I like the mess, I said. The mess is honest. There's no pretense in a ruin, Iris. I spent my whole life training for a perfection that turned out to be cold. This is real. I reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. I placed my hand on the wall beside her head, boxing her in, but not touching her. Not yet. I created a space where only we existed, a geometry of two. Look at me. She lifted her eyes. They were wide, dark, and terrified. But they were open. Tell me to leave, I whispered, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. Tell me you don't want this, and I will walk out that door and never come back. But don't you dare lie to me. The silence stretched, heavy and electric, poised on the edge of the blade. I watched her pupils dilate in the gloom. She wasn't looking at the exit anymore. She was looking at my mouth. I can't, she whispered. The words were barely air, but they hit me harder than a physical blow. I can't tell you to leave, because I've been waiting for you to knock since October. The admission cracked the last of the plaster. She wasn't just hiding the financial ruin. She was hiding the obsession. The distance hadn't just been about pride. It was about protection from the intensity of this. I watched you, she continued, the words tumbling out now, faster, desperate. Every morning. I knew your schedule better than my own. I knew you took your break at the park on Tuesdays. I knew you double-knotted your left boot. I graded papers by the window just to catch the flash of blue uniform passing the hedge. I lived for that 10-minute window. She took a shuddering breath, her hands uncrossing, falling to her sides, open and defenseless. When the money ran out, when he left, the only thing that felt solid was you. You were precise. You were consistent. And I was terrified that if I let you in, if I let myself want you, I would shatter completely. I'm empty, Riley. I have nothing left to give you but debts and boxes to pack. I am a disaster. I don't need you to be full, I said, my voice rough, stepping into the space she had finally yielded. And I don't mind a disaster. Disasters are honest. I didn't wait for the logic to catch up. I closed the gap. The kiss wasn't tentative. It wasn't the polite brush of skin I'd imagined for months. It was a collision. It tasted of salt and coffee and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. It was the moment the blade finally connects, the electric signal that registers the point, but magnified 1,000 times. Her hands found the leather of my jacket, gripping tight, pulling me in as if I were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. My hands found the curve of her jaw, the pulse hammering wildly against my palm. The geometry of the hallway vanished. There were no angles anymore, no calculated distances to maintain. There was just the heat of her body pressing against mine, the desperate, hungry way she opened to me. I had spent years thinking victory was a clean statistic, a result you could measure on a scoreboard or hang on a wall. I thought it was about control. I was wrong. Victory felt like this. It felt like Iris exhaling against my mouth, a sound of absolute surrender. It felt like the tension leaving her frame, the way she melted into the contact, trusting me to hold her up when she could no longer stand on her own. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was the opposite of discipline, and it was the best thing I had ever felt. The bronze medal in my drawer was just metal. This woman, this heat, this vulnerability was the prize I hadn't known I was competing for. We broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads resting against each other in the gloom. The house was still dark. The foreclosure notice was still on the table. The future was still a terrifying question mark. But the silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was shared. "I'm not going anywhere," I murmured against her skin, my thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "We'll figure out the house. We'll figure out the mess. But I'm not walking away." She let out a laugh, a wet, shaky sound that vibrated through her chest into mine. "You're stubborn." "I'm an Olympian," I corrected, feeling a smile tug at my lips. "We don't know how to quit." She turned her face into my hand, kissing my palm. It was a gesture of absolute trust, raw and unflinching. The barriers had fallen, but we were both still standing in the rubble. And for the first time, the view looked perfect. The route hasn't changed. The streets are the same, the bag is still heavy, but the geometry is different now. 42 Elm Street isn't just a number on a checklist or a variable in the data set. It's the destination. I used to think the job was about delivering things people needed. I was wrong. The most important things aren't delivered in an envelope. They're found in the rain, in the mess, and in the courage to stay when the walls come down. If you've ever found something unexpected in your routine, subscribe for more stories.